This is your PowerPoint for the PowerPoint quiz on the Mongols and the steppe people. Geographical context. So it's really important to understand the geographical context in order to understand the steppe people and the Mongols, where they were coming from and why they organized themselves in the way that they did. Steppe people originated from Mongolia and the area north of what are known as the Caucasian Mountains. Just keep in mind what this area would have looked like. The area was highly elevated into plateaus of mountains, and that's why it's called steppe, because the steppe region would be these mountains that almost look like steps that elevated higher and higher up into these higher elevations. These areas were incredibly cold and mostly were like a desert climate. Now that doesn't mean that you couldn't grow anything in these regions. You could. In fact, up at the higher plateaus, there were plains for farming, but the problem is that they're at such a high elevation that the amount of crops you can grow is very limited, and the variety of crops that you can grow is very limited. So whenever you have a context like this where things are very hard to survive in, you end up having very strong and loyal family relationships that are based upon these local kin-like relationships based upon tribal culture and kinship lineage. Origins and influence. So the first group that we know of that were in the steppe group are the Xiongnu. The Xiongnu were led by a man named Modun, and he eventually created all these different tribes, and they included tribes that would eventually go out and conquer areas. This included the Berbers, with the Arabs, the Turks, and eventually the Mongols. They would eventually be so successful that they spread out through the Middle East and northern Africa. Now the big question is why? I mean, if you think about this, we're talking about these local tribal groups that are based upon hunting and gathering and some very local farming. Why would they be so successful in being able to conquer these major civilizations throughout the world? In fact, one of the areas that they conquer is Afghanistan. Nobody's conquered Afghanistan throughout human history except for the Mongols. So you really have to ask, how did these small tribal groups become so successful? Part of the reason has to do with their innovations. Living in this very difficult environment, they innovated and created things like the saddle. Now, the saddle to us today doesn't seem like that big of a deal, but imagine it at that time period. You could have a saddle on a horse that would allow for Mongols to ride into an area and be secured, riding into an area at top speeds, but it also allowed them to train themselves where they could ride, let go of the reins of their horses, and then be able to fire bows and arrows into the people that they were going in to attack, also using their swords to be able to do that. That gives them two advantages in military tactics. Anybody in the military knows that generally speaking, you want to have a height advantage and you want to have a speed advantage. This gives them both of these advantages at the same time. How successful were this? Well, they spread throughout the civilizations of the Persians, the Chinese, and Byzantium. So the Mongols themselves. The Mongols started off as a fragmented group of tribes. They did not have a centralized bureaucracy or authority. During that time period, there was a man who grew up named Temujin, and Temujin grew up in a number of tribes because his father had been killed in the war between the tribes. As he grew up, he realized that this was the primary problem of the Mongols. They were fragmented, they had no leadership. So he organized the tribes together under his own leadership, and then using that, he expanded outwards and conquered areas all the way from Korea and China out to Russia and Central Asia. The Mongols' culture. So the Mongols did have a culture, but the culture was very vague and it wasn't all that centralized. The Mongols, generally speaking, were a fragmented group of tribes, and so their culture and spiritual beliefs go back to the sort of like ancient beliefs of the first tribal groups of people. That means they were pantheists and they were naturalists. So again, pantheists are people who believe that the gods reside within nature, and the naturalists believe that these gods in nature can be represented especially through animals. So they're pantheists, they're naturalists, and they're animists. They believed that there was one central god, though, that reigned over all the other gods, named Tengri. However, they eventually did not really have a strong sense of a centralized culture, so then when they went out and conquered different areas, they would become assimilated into these cultures. So eventually the Mongols actually almost disappeared. They didn't disappear biologically, but they disappeared culturally as they would be assimilated into the cultures that they conquered. So this allowed both for assimilation and it allowed for the Mongols to diffuse culture throughout the Middle East and India. So why were the Mongols so successful? One of the reasons why they were so successful is that the empires that they conquered were already fragmented or faced internal problems. For example, there were the Abbasids, the Shiite empire of the Muslims. It had already overexpanded and faced numerous problems of internal corruption. This allowed the Mongols to conquer them. In some cases, the other invaders had made the empire weak. For example, the Jurchens came in from the northern part of China and conquered the northern part of China, pushing the Song dynasty all the way down to the south. So the Song turned to the Mongols in the hopes to ally and then to use that as a way to get rid of the Jurchens. Instead, what the Mongols were able to do was able to conquer the Song Chinese. But probably one of the best things they did was to offer liberation to conquered peasants in the Middle Ages. So what that meant was they would go into a town and they would basically tell them, you have a choice. You can join with us against your landowners, or we're going to kill you. And if you think about it, most peasants are going to end up joining with the Mongols just because at that time period we're talking about the feudal ages. So the peasants don't really have a lot of freedom, nor do they have a lot of land. So this offered them what they thought was going to be liberation. Once the Mongols did conquer, they were very intelligent in allowing for local religious tolerance. This meant at that time period that they didn't have to worry about internal rebellions. And on top of that, once they conquered these areas, they recreated the Silk Road trade routes and they provided security on these trade routes. That allowed them then to build up wealth since they're right in the middle of the Middle East and basically have trade all going away from China and India out to northern Africa. So this allows these new Mongol civilizations to be extremely strong and very wealthy and prosperous. China and the Mongols. So we're going to take a look at 3 different cases of what happened after the Mongols lost their leader, Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan made the mistake that most leaders have made in world history. He did not provide for a clear succession of who was to come after him. Because of that, his sons fought for power and ended up fragmenting this huge Mongol empire. For example, Ogadai, one of Genghis Khan's sons, ended up fighting against the Song dynasty. Originally, he allied with the Song against the Jurchens, but then he turned on the Song dynasty, conquered it, and then started to control China. The Mongols saw the Chinese basically as second-class citizens and forced them into assimilating into an overall political system where the Mongols would be in charge. One of the leaders after this time period was Kublai Khan, who led this Yuan dynasty and forged new technologies. It was out of this time period that we had the printing press, the navigational technologies, gunpowder, and paper. This is the time period when the Chinese are going to create all these major innovations. For them, unfortunately, they don't implement these technologies well. Eventually, Marco Polo is going to take these innovations, bring them back to Europe. Europe will innovate with these, and they are going to then dominate because of that. Eventually, what happened was Kublai Khan attempted to invade Japan, and he failed. As he sent out his navy to invade Japan, there were huge typhoon storms that whipped up and destroyed his navy, and this happened on 2 different occasions. The Japanese would eventually call these the spiritual storms, or the kamikaze storms. There was also plagues and internal rebellions that eventually led to the end of the Yuan dynasty. Mongols in Persia. So the Persians viewed the Mongols as infidels, and it's basically as these barbaric, uncivilized groups. So this eventually led to an aggressive campaign where the Mongols massacred the Persians. However, once the Mongols had conquered the Persians, they then adopted most of the Persian culture and Persian way of running their government, and they then set up trade routes along the Silk Road. So the Mongols eventually became assimilated into the Persian world, unlike the Mongols in China who dominated the Chinese. Russia and the Mongols. The Mongols also invaded up north under the group called the Golden Horde. At that time period, Russia was run by something called the Kievan Rus, which was disorganized and really didn't pose much of a strong defense because they just didn't have a very strong army at that time period. So this was very easy then for the Mongols to subordinate the Russians to their power. But like we saw with the Persians, the Mongols just became assimilated into Russian culture. In fact, the Mongols became a part of the Orthodox Eastern faith. This led to a massive Russian empire that included the central areas of Russia all the way out to the farming wilderness to the east. In fact, I would think what I want you to see here is something very similar to what's going to eventually happen in the United States. In the United States, we had an eastern coast with strong cities and manufacturing culture, and then we had a western area of sort of a frontier that was eventually settled. This is what Russia becomes, but just on the opposite side. You have Russia, its central part up in Moscow as being the central city, and then the eastern side being this farming side that becomes sort of the frontier region. So what are the effects of the Mongols? Well, I think the Mongols are difficult to really summarize because you can come down to one of 2 possibilities. One possibility that's seen throughout most of history is that the Mongols are just these barbaric, uncivilized people. The other possibility is to see the Mongols as bringing about a whole bunch of positive effects. I think it's really a balance between the 2. We shouldn't lose the fact that the Mongols did spread terror throughout the Middle Eastern Europe. They were the ones who came up with these new military innovations like the stirrups, the compound bow, and the saddle to gain advantage. And when they did, they would go into areas and they would literally wipe them out. They would go into local cities and burn them to the ground. They were known for having done very brutal tactics as they would attack civilizations that they were about to conquer. In fact, Western civilizations, seeing them coming, saw them as barbaric and used to talk about them as being these horrible creatures. For example, St. Jerome at one point described the Mongols as being barely men. They were more beast than they were men. And the Western civilizations had a pretty good reason to describe them that way. When they would go into regions, they would utterly decimate areas. They were known for raping and pillaging cities. They were brutal in the way that they would attack. However, I think if we stop there, we lose a lot of the positive impacts, even if they were unintentional, that the Mongols brought to civilization. First of all, the Mongols assimilated with local cultures. Their original attacks were barbaric, but eventually they settled down, and when they did, they became basically civilized and a part of these civilizations just like everybody else did. They also resurrected the Silk Road trade route, which is incredibly important in world history. Without the Silk Road trade route, Europe would never have gotten all the innovations that were achieved through China. They would never have been able to do the exploration that they did. And they provided for a stable system of trade that included both security and taxation throughout the Middle East. This allowed for cultural diffusion and technological diffusion. The Polo family would come into contact with Kublai Khan and the Yuan dynasty, and this allowed for Europe to eventually do the explorations. But there's also another effect of the Mongols, which is really entirely unintentional and really gets into one of the major causes of change within world history, and that is disease. The Mongols carried the Black Death to Europe. Probably the way that it started off is the way a lot of diseases start off in world history. What happens is you get these poor communities, especially out in Southeast Asia, where farmers have to almost live with their animals on a daily basis. And I mean this very literally. At night, farmers would go into their barns, which are very small, out in these wilderness areas, and they would have to sleep with their animals to make sure that the animals either didn't escape, didn't get killed by other animals, or weren't destroyed by weather. The problem, though, is that animals contract diseases so easily, and when you're sleeping that close to animals, diseases pass off very easily. The Black Death killed between 50 to 90% of the people that it affected, and it eventually led to the demise of the Mongols themselves. However, out in Europe, there was also another effect that this would cause. It challenged the power of the elite landowners. After the Black Death was done, there were so few people to come out and work that elite landowners had to raise pay in order to attract people to come and work for them. This didn't work for very long for them because they didn't want to have to keep paying such high rates, and so they came up with new systems like the three-field system for mass production, where one field would be planting one crop, a second field would be creating another crop, and then a third field you would lay fallow or just basically have it be fertilized for the year, so that then by the next year you could rotate these crops. This allowed for landowners to mass produce on their fields with less labor. So where did all this labor go to? Well, it led to the rise of cities in Western Europe and the rise of a new merchant class. And that merchant class is then going to challenge the feudal order and start to change it during the next era, the era of exploration.